Should we begin the session then? And Florence, do you want to kick off with your presentation?
Sure, okay. Let's get this going. Cool. So this is my presentation is probably going, well, hopefully going to be fairly short and maybe more discursive than anything else. And kind of, yeah, more like food for thought for the Q&A and for what I'm sure will be a really interesting discussion following our presentations. So it's just some ruminations, particularly from my perspective as the kind of designer that I am on the question of designing for our future. So what design for what future? As I mentioned before, I am a user experience designer. That's what one of the things you'll often see on my LinkedIn. But more broadly, I tend to call myself a service designer because that's actually where a lot of my work tends to lie. With a slight tendency to focus on digital products. So kind of overall services that are punctuated by digital experiences. And I am also a researcher. So yes, you can do both at the same time. And an academic and something of a maker. So kind of hack around, mostly with front end code and craft and all kinds of good stuff in between. So when I'm kind of approaching this question, you know, as I said, I can really only approach it as a service designer. And so as a service designer, if you were to look up what the definition of service design actually is, so you'll see lots of definitions that talk about making sure all the kind of components, so that might be teams, departments, organizations, businesses even, making sure that, that they all work together to be able to provide a coherent like experience for a customer, for a user, for a particular audience. And because that kind of requires a slightly more holistic and actually quite data-centric approach, that tends to be how I also think about design and thus the future of it. So really, to sum all of that up, really, for me as a service designer, to think about the future, to think about anything, understanding the context that it's in is fundamental. Now, I mentioned that, yes, I am a service designer, but my background, ironically enough, perhaps, is in theoretical physics. So that was the topic, that's what I studied at university, and that's one of the things that I'm still really passionate about. And the particular area I'm really interested in is complex systems. And so anytime someone talks about the future, I always get a little bit antsy because I feel like I can only be true to my background, to my original training, and to be totally honest and upfront that one of the problems with the future is that it's emerging from a complex system. And if you talk to any mathematician or physicist or scientist or policymaker or anyone who has to deal with or interact with complex systems, they can be quite hard to predict. And annoyingly, they tend to get really hard to predict often when it matters the most. But one of the ways that you can kind of mitigate that is by almost taking a step back and really thinking about what are the factors in the overall system, what are the levers, as it were, in the system. And that can kind of help you, even if you can't fully predict what the future will be, it can at least help you understand some of that context, right? Understand some of the things where very interesting disruptions or innovations might occur. So I thought, just to be provocative, I might go through a few that just comes to the top of my head at lots of different scales. So for example, obviously the most pressing one at the moment is the environment. I think it's really important, especially for us who work in digital, to never forget that everything is grounded and rooted in physical reality. The tech that we make absolutely relies on precious elements that are only found in particular areas of the world. There's really if you really want to get into the history of how mining affects what kind of video games you can make, There's really great use cases in some of the early Nintendo and PlayStation consoles, where entire civil wars in Central and West Africa affected the output of these video game consoles, and that in turn really had a massive effect, as you can probably imagine, on what say graphic designers or digital designers could have made. I always think that's quite an extreme case, but it is a good example of how things that we often tend to forget actually do impact and will impact what we do, how we do it, the economics of how we do it, and I might touch on that a bit later and hopefully in the conversation. All of these are really part of that context of design. There's also the other aspect, which again, I think is becoming ever more apparent. You know, climate chaos is a real thing. And again, particularly as we're observing and hearing about people all around the world talking about heat waves and levels of humidity that are literally at the limits of the physical human experience. This is all the kind of stuff that informs both economies and the resultant problems that come out of those, that in turn will affect what kind of job opportunities you might end up being able to find or get in the next decade or so, as well as the kind of things that you can even make, full stop. There's also things like the stock market. I increasingly do actually encourage, it used to be more of a joke, but these days I do actually increasingly encourage designers to flick through the Financial Times, like open it up every now and again. There are ways of, it is behind a paywall, but there are ways of reading content behind paywalls, so you can find that out. I think you're at college, so hopefully you should also be able to make use of a college subscription as well. And whilst they're definitely not things to maybe take as dogma, they are things that can, again, provide a lot of context behind why certain companies or certain products or certain digital platforms are behaving or changing or doing the kind of things they're doing. Twitter is a really great example, although it's the same for many other social media platforms. So I don't want anyone to think I'm particularly getting at Twitter. I am not. They are just as bad as everyone else. But often, for example, a digital experience that is like highly evaluated often then experiences a kind of imperative to try to do lots of interactions on their platform that will encourage deeper engagement in order to justify the kind of money they can demand from companies for advertising. So if ever you experience any very strange experiences on like Twitter or Facebook or Tumblr, well, not so much Tumblr actually, they're okay, but Instagram, often what you're really experiencing is the side effect actually of the stock market, of valuation of a company and a company feeling like it has to live up to what it's in quotes, promising through the stock market. So pay attention to that. That's often quite cool, cool as context. Down at the very bottom, kind of brought in a bit about space. Again, I think this is not necessarily something new, but it's as much representing that there are all these different newer industries, or rather old industries that are going into quite different directions. And are potentially providing both lots of opportunities directly, i.e. this is a whole industry one might want to go and work, but also providing additional capability for existing companies, such as, for example, Amazon or Tesla. You know, the fact that they are part of they are part of a conglomerate that has the additional capabilities, whether in data gathering, whether in policy, whether in whatever sphere, all of these things are part of like a connected ecosystem. But yeah, also do pay attention to these industries that you might not expect have lots of really interesting opportunities for yourselves as designers. I included something about video games as well, because I often find where video games go is where the rest of The rest of tech follows. That's a slight exaggeration, but I do think it is true that in many ways, the interactions, even the business paradigms of tech often follow the lead of the video game industry, for better and for much worse. So again, pay attention to the kind of the kind of affordances that are coming out from video games, as well as the kind of business practices and how those are impacting the kind of interactions, the kind of graphics, the kind of even the hype, even the marketing around these experiences. All of these things are actually deeply entwined with each other. So pay attention to that. Read game journalists, read more critical game journalists as well. One of my favorites is Jim Sterling, but there are plenty others. And finally, and this really was just me being a bit like provocative, you know, I think it's really important as well not to forget the fact that politics as well can really impact the arena in which we as designers are working. So for example, for all that Trump has been booted off Twitter and many other social media platforms, I'm sure it doesn't take much for you to find the copycats, the people, the rest of the alt-right who are still very much a viable and noteworthy presence, whether on social media, on other media channels or platforms like YouTube or Vimeo. And we know that, for example, people who we know about the connections between, for example, folks like Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytica, and how much they themselves tend to look at trends in general society, and learn as well, perhaps from groups who you might not expect. I always find it really interesting when remembering how it was Steve Bannon, of all people, who often say that if you want to know what's actually happening in the future, look towards the LGBT and the Black community. Not because of the fact that he particularly likes them or wants to help them out, but he understood the fact that often if you want to see like the cool new things where you can start kind of gathering data from or start learning about trends from, those are the particular pockets to look of society to look towards. And we're also seeing as well, if we're thinking more broadly about technology, the way that some of this rhetoric and the way that some of these conceptions about society and how we should live with each other, how we shouldn't live with each other, these in turn do impact politics and policies, and they in turn either provide more opportunities for, say, data extraction, or indeed for use of smart technologies. If we think about Fortress Europe and the way that Britain and the EU kind of uses technologies to kind of defend so-called the borders from often climate refugees, which again kind of shows that interaction with environment, as I kind of mentioned before. So, as I said, as a service designer and as someone who studies complex systems, you can never fully predict what is going to happen, but you can at least kind of get a sense of what sort of things to look out for when you understand what kind of factors influence the things that happen, quite frankly. And I'm a good old-fashioned materialist, so yes, I'm all about looking at tangible causes of things. So, in light of this, in light of what I've just said, these are some of the questions that when I'm thinking about these factors, when I'm thinking about complex systems, these are some of the questions that help me to think about the future that I might be working in, the future I might be designing. So one of those questions is who has power, you know, who is being harmed by the things that are being made. Even really basic questions like who talks to who. Relationships are super important to evaluate. They help you understand where potential networking, potential business opportunities exist. And they also give a good insight into why perhaps certain industries work the way they do or innovate in the way they do. Questions like who can actually make decisions. It's easy to talk about involvement, user engagement, but ultimately, there's often very few people who can actually make the hard decisions about which direction a product, a technology, or whatever tends to go. So pay attention to that. kind of related, where's the money going? Like, who is actually getting what type of value out of a particular scenario, technology, design, practice, etc., etc. What type of decisions can get made? Because they're often, again, very limited by the context one finds oneself in. What is actually happening beneath the surface? There's quite a lot, and we'll probably, who knows, get into this a bit more. It's really interesting how much of technology is often more a case of a mechanical Turk. And if you're interested in what that means, I would definitely look it up, because that will probably reveal a very interesting history of technology that goes back like a good 350 years, and actually is very, very applicable to much of today's apparently high-tech, really cool high-tech technology. And that's related to the kind of question, another question I'm always asking, like, what's real and what's hype? Now, I think, trying to bring it all down to something a bit more specific, I think the past year and a half, it's probably going to be a bit longer than that, but I think what we've definitely seen is that we can, and we globally, locally, nationally, that we can respond quite quickly to quite rapid changes, which in some ways is a good thing. So we've seen that, and I'm talking as much around the world as I am locally, so not all of these things might locally apply. But we have seen, for example, the rapid response of countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, China, eventually to COVID-19, for example. We have seen, in terms of human networking, which obviously I, as a service designer, am very interested in, the launch of all these mutual aid networks, and associated with that, all these digital platforms that enable people to connect their skills and their money. We are in the midst of, especially given the financial context, actually a really interestingly efficient vaccination drive led by the NHS. We have seen that some companies have been very quick to allow workers to work from home. But again, always look at what's happening beneath the surface. It's always important to ask ourselves, who gets to work from home? Again, quite relevantly, I think we've also seen real kind of flexibility in like new ways of learning. Again, though, it's always good to question like who benefits from this, and also like the amount of effort and energy it takes to enable this, and whether that's actually adequately compensated. But I think whilst we've seen this really great this evidence of humans being fantastic, and humans are fantastic, but I think we've also seen what we are as a community, again, whether globally, whether nationally, locally, whatever, we've also seen what we are increasingly susceptible to. So at the moment, certainly one of the things that we're seeing, and this is happening all around the world, and disturbingly very similar things happening all around the world. We've seen political corruption. We've seen, and I think quite pertinently actually for us as designers, whether that's digital or specifically or more broadly, actually we've also seen how this has been deeply interconnected with the questions of data exploitation and inadequate data protection, as was seen with the fact that like contracts that were given to companies that really aren't particularly specialists or particularly much better than others, again, out of corrupt networking, actually then ended up taking approaches to data storage that actually to put it at risk. And in fact, in quite horrendous ways. There's the infamous data in the spreadsheet debacle from last year. We've also seen that we are, again, still very susceptible to poor digital services. I think particularly for those who may be like working or learning from home, I think we've definitely hopefully got a better understanding of the disparities in, for example, like connectivity and even our devices. That's certainly something I've I've definitely experienced myself working as I am now, mostly from home. We've also seen in a sense, we're really seeing when we've been talking about the digital divide for the past decade and a half, like what it really means, as well as the systemic bigotry that is riddled throughout all of our automated systems. And I think that really did come to light if you think about the grade scandal of last year, the predictive grade scandal of last year. And also still, the amount of technologies that are kind of being pushed towards industries who are, again, perhaps having to save costs on, given what they might have lost, say, on rent, having, now everyone's working from home. Also seeing how with some of these technologies that are being promised to make things more efficient and better for businesses, again, they are still very much biased against Black people, against women, against gay people, against trans people, against working class people, against disabled people. And that, I think, is something that, again, we knew it before, and actually now I think it's something that's really come out and it's become particularly more evident, I would say. Now, it's always good to be as pragmatic as possible. So whilst these are all really big, highfalutin questions and issues to think about, in terms of like the really basic practical nature of life, look, as designers, so long as people are willing to pay us money, there will be opportunities. And certainly right now, although obviously it is actually a particularly well-known fallacy to take what is happening right now as absolutely indicative of the future. The reality is that if you are to search for like UX, UI, digital design, experience design, game design jobs, like they're still there. Some of them might use slightly different terms in the job description, but if you look at like the fundamental asks of what skills you need, they're all the things that you will have been trained in. So on one level, I can say, like, yeah, I think the money still exists for, like I said, for better or for worse. And I think the system is going to probably keep fairly stable. I think simply at least seeing the amount of investment, again, this is why Financial Times and similar papers are really great to follow. I think the amount of investment that we're seeing in developing and optimizing remote platforms for remote working, for remote learning, yeah, at least for the next couple of years, this is probably going to be something that will, again, keep hiring us and keep providing people more opportunities, working even in sectors like the cultural sector. Well, I mean, we're all still suffering from the fact that we've essentially had a year of like lost income. So again, even though we're beginning to open up again, we are still interested in trying to create, really great remote monetizable experiences. That's also the really key thing. So the opportunities are going to be there. But one thing I always say as well is that the opportunities of tomorrow might not even be conceivable now. I mean, my job, I had no idea existed, even when I graduated, which from uni, yet alone when I was in college or when I was doing my GCSEs. And in fact, the nature of my job has also changed quite a bit. If you'd spoken to me when I first started out as a UX/experience service designer, I wouldn't have quite imagined that I would be doing the kinds of things that I am doing right now. And so in light of that, really trying to think again about what it is that you can always still hold on to that you've been learning so far. In a sense, the thing to learn from that is that you are always going to be a perpetual student. And so in some ways, you have to keep yourself being informed. As I said, read as much as you can, read from, especially in other sectors, because they often provide like the missing links between why certain things are happening, even in the industries or sectors that you might be working in. Be present, show up, you don't have to like attend every single meetup, but go to them, go to where people are, listen to what people are saying, ask lots of questions. The really interesting, weird projects, whether you think they're going to be successful, whether you think they're just hype and kind of silly, show up, be present, hear what's going on, because that again is how you can begin to see either new opportunities or at least what kind of factors are impacting what potential opportunities or what potential issues or challenges there are to solve. Obviously, be curious. Again, keep asking questions. Like never, like, and keep asking questions of everyone. And take advantage of, say, things like free courses, and especially in completely different topics. I think if you're going to go off and become a designer, it's like your full-time job. I really would highly recommend, you know, every now and again, take a course in, I don't know, like art history, or science of the gut. FutureLearn is really great for random and very high quality courses, as well as things like Coursera and stuff like that. But yeah, be curious, like really keep digging into the world around us, because it's a fantastic place to be. And you never know what really great things might come out of it. Be critical. This is kind of related to that question about what's real, what's hype. You know, people need to sell stuff, people need to make money, and people need to do what they can just to survive. So in response, the best thing one can be often is just to be a bit critical, just to keep asking those questions, like actually asking how much of this is hype, like how much of this is actual material, tangible reality, how much of this is just words that we're saying just to kind of either make ourselves feel better or to avoid the deeper underlying question. And last, and be disciplined. You know, if you're going to, I know it might sometimes feel frustrating when like your tutors or your lecturers are always giving you deadlines and telling you how to work. But honestly, that is one of the things that, if there's anything I still really, really value from my educational experience, and that really is from secondary school all the way through to university, it is discipline. It is sometimes, it is giving yourself homework. It is being really strict with yourself sometimes. If you, it is sometimes, if even when you're lost for inspiration on a project, I often find myself going back to the tricks and techniques from my AS level art class from like Mrs. Owen, which was all about how to get your brain thinking in different ways, but also how to do things to time. Because yeah, you want to be respectful of your co-workers. You want to also be respectful of yourself. So keep that in mind. And finally, you know, be collaborative. Keep learning from other people, other designers, other makers, academics, other experts, and share what it is that you've learned, because it will always be of value and other people can learn from it in turn. And I think especially if we're looking at these really big holistic challenges, or these like all these factors that will impact our opportunities, the way we work, it is so important that we're sharing and learning from each other. So I'm going to end on that note, on, you know, be collaborative. If you want to kind of start out as you mean to go on, I guess, you know, here are some like current really interesting communities for designers. Mostly, it has to be said, I think, well, two of them are mostly in digital design, but they're really great places if you want to kind of start working in that collaborative, critical, like really intriguing kind of way. Yeah, take a screenshot, take a note. I will also put them in the chat as well. And yeah, so that's pretty much all from me. That, you know, if we're thinking about what the future we want and the future that we can design, hopefully it's one where we will actually be truly collaborative, and working for the betterment of all, I guess. So yeah, that's me. That's that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Florence. Yeah, a lot to unpack there in that. I've taken a lot of notes. But I think we should hear from Kevin first. So Kevin, do you want to share your presentation?
Yeah, sure. And firstly, thanks, Florence. That was really, really good, really interesting. Okay, let me share the section on the screen. Hopefully you guys can all see this. Great. So Yeah, our design future. I'm going to start off just talking a bit of an intro about myself and about the studio Kin and the work that we've done. So I'm going to start with our show reel, which is about 2.5 minutes long and gives you a bit of a taster of sort of projects that we've done. And I'll talk to you about them in a little bit more detail and then get into the few trends that I'm seeing come through from the future. So I'm going to run VT, as they say. So we're a small interaction design studio, and as you can see from that show reel, our work is very varied and it's hard to sort of pigeonhole, but our work is a kind of 50-50 split between work for museums and galleries and work for brands. The project you see on the left there is a piece that we did for Damien Hirst, and the project on the right for an installation that we did for Google, a physical installation to teach people about computing. Our work really varies in scale as well. So on the left is a big hanging chandelier of screens that we did for a big entrance space gallery for the Museum Science and Industry in Manchester, through to small projects. So this is a research piece on the right that we did for Microsoft, and it's a pollution badge which detects the pollution levels around you. Our work can be temporary and pop up. On the left-hand side, a piece for Google that was all made out of origami, tracing paper, and LED lights, and also permanent. The piece on the right was for the ITV. It's a 16-meter-long stainless steel piece of architectural seating that's also interactive, and you can change the colors of an ITV logo, which I think you saw on the show reel as well. Our work can be pretty sort of fun and a bit crazy as well. So we do stuff, the piece that we did on the left was a dress made out of 80 mobile phones, smartphones, new phones that were launched by Nokia for Fjordal Golan, and that launched London Fashion Week back in 2014. And very practical work as well. On the right-hand side, a series of maths books called Maths No Problem, which is now part of the English National Curriculum. We use tech in different ways, not necessarily the latest tech. Sometimes we go back and often using old theatre techniques. The image you see on the left here is Alexander Graham Bell and his experiments in communicating sound over distance by transferring sound into light and back into sound again, which is a technique we use for a project for the Imperial War Museum. And we do create our own technology, messing around with our own PCB boards and things like Arduino and processing to get computers to do interesting things. So our work is very much a mixture of desk-based design work, but also physical making. And it's that combination between physical and digital, both in the way that we make work and both in the work that we execute, that is really our kind of forte, I think. And people often ask, where does the word kin come from? And it's really a nod to kinesthetic learning. And this is learning and educating in different ways. So not just through visual medium, but using all the senses. And, you know, when to learn by yourself solitarily, when to learn in a group, when to do things that are playful, physical. And we try to really engage all the different senses in all the sort of interactive installations that we create. So check out more of our work on our website, and I've got our contact details and stuff later, which I'll put up on screen. And you can see some of those projects in more detail. But I want to get into the meat of the subject, which is our design futures. And this is really looking here at 3 trends. And as Florence said, it's very hard to predict the future. But I think it's interesting to look at what is happening generally in the world around us. And obviously through the tumultuous year and a half that we've all been through, and how these changes are going to stay with us. Some changes for the good, some changes for the bad, and where these changes might go with new technologies that are on the horizon. So we're going to look at 3 different trends. They happen to be 3 R's. The first one is remote. This image here, I think we're all very familiar with, something that we've been feeling over the last year and a half. And this sort of feeling of total Zoom boredom and Zoom tiredness. And I, for one, find Zoom and Teams and things like that very, very tiring compared to real interaction. But, you know, we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic spread. We've seen organizations around the world forced to have their employees work from home and accelerating that remote working trend. So physical workspaces, you know, when physical workspaces do reopen, many employees, you know, whether they're, you know, up for it or not, may be reluctant to go back to the traditional office. A lot of offices have closed down. A lot of areas of London where our studio used to be in Shoreditch have completely changed and have become like ghost towns, and it's very sad to see. And the real knock-on effect to that is all the smaller businesses that are around there, all the coffee shops, all the key cutters, all the hairdressers, all the news agents, and, you know, I've had many of them shutting down as well, as we've seen. So this is really transforming the way that cities, especially cities like London, big cities, London, Manchester, etc., you know, organize themselves, and how they've been organized for years and years based on office culture, based on everybody going down the pub on a Friday lunchtime. You know, all that sort of culture has completely changed and transformed, and maybe for the better. You know, this was something that was always coming. But what are the design opportunities that are there? Because let's face it, things like Teams and Zooms, they're pretty horrible. And what can we do in these AR and VR spaces that can be more engaging, that could be more collaborative, so that we're actually using more than just sight and sound. We're using touch, we're using haptics to be able to have that real world conversations that we used to do, to be able to engage in those sort of brainstorms and those sort of meetings that are quite hard to do. This is an image here from a remote 3D XR vision software, which is really interesting, which you should check out, which is I've had a go on it myself, and you can do it through your phone or through your laptop or through VR glasses. And it's quite an interesting way to move around a 3D object and discuss it and work on it remotely. But there's a line between, when the line, you know, between home and office is non-existent, we've got to be careful to understand the psychological and social trade-offs. You know, while immersive remote technology may help to sort of alleviate this isolation, you know, it might exacerbate those feelings of alienation. You know, people aren't going to feel so happy with this new world. And so as we push deeper into virtual worlds, we can't forget also that this is going to require support. It's going to require a supply and maintenance for, you know, of these systems and getting these systems to work correctly. This example here is a really old example, but I think still really relevant. This lovely example of being able to take that virtual world and move it into a shared physical space by moving these columns up and down to create shapes and spaces. This is a piece that was done by MIT. And there's some really, really exciting new technologies that are happening. This is a piece from Google, which they've just been working on, where they're talking about 3D volumetric video conferencing calls, bringing people together from across the world, people who haven't seen each other for a very long time, grandparents that haven't seen their grandchildren at all. And by using 3D imaging and volumetric displays, you can see around, behind, to the sides of people. And by combining this with really good compression techniques in terms of delivery and increasing bandwidths, we can start to get a really feeling that you're in the room with somebody else. And so this is really exciting. You know, what can we do with this? What are the UI, UX sort of opportunities that we can do with this technology if we can really feel that we are in the room with somebody from the other side of the world? So the next area I want to look at and trend is reality. You know, in our world at the moment, where personalized digital experiences are extending our daily lives, individuals will really need to take a personal control over how they experience their own reality. So we've seen in different walks of life how reality is getting really twisted, fake news, and with deep fake techniques that are happening now, and how these are getting more and more sophisticated. So with the help of, you know, algorithms and user preferences, our digital interactions are tailored to the user, resulting in unique experience. Even though that we use the same internet, I'm seeing a completely different news feed to that somebody else's. And that's going to get more and more into the minutiae, that I might not just only be seeing the same image, but a twisted or different crop of an image or video, or different clip of the same video piece, depending on my preferences. So, you know, how long before this bleeds over into the real world, dramatically impacting on how we perceive real locations, physical objects, and even real people and animals around us? We're seeing new technologies come online, and we're seeing, you know, the Apple glasses and Google glasses has been a technology that really, you know, I thought was going to come on a lot more than it has. But I think, and we're seeing in the next sort of few years, this sort of technology and this overlaying of AR sort of layers on what we're seeing, rather than just what we're seeing through our phones, but seeing through our glasses, is going to really take off. And so I'll be seeing a different reality to the people around me. So taking the Snapchat, Instagrams, and TikTok filters to their logical extremes, really. It's only a matter of time before we're able to change and shape the real world around us with these digital tools. So not only could these overlays act as like an intermediary between us and our physical environment, having the ability to project immersive, photorealistic digital imagery over our surroundings, and it will really force to question us what is real at all, and does real really matter in any case? Does it really matter that what we're actually creating, these kind of pseudo realities, is really what's important? And we're doing this in many ways already. So is this just taking it to the next step? So, you know, challenging realities even further, there's a future where we no longer need an intermediary of a screen to transform what we see around us. You know, we can take this even further. I mean, one of the starts with this is Google Translate. Do we really need to learn foreign languages anymore, when we can look through a device and in the future look through our glasses, even our own eyes, and instantly words are translated, instantly in an earpiece in my ear, just like the Babelfish from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is becoming more and more a reality. I can hear what somebody else is saying in a different language without having to understand it. You know, and even going into, in the future, in neural implants, you know, can we have an implant on our brain which gives us a new skill ability, gives us a new ability to speak a different language? You know, and could this be hacked? and reprogrammed? Could we even create a kind of virtual lobotomy if this is in the wrong hands? So in the future, where technology advances such as VR and AR and even these neural chips will have the power to shape our worldview, you know, it will be up to us to decide how much control we ultimately sort of give away and give up. And looking forward, we need to see a really reality check. Keeping a footing in reality will require like a personal reflection. And, you know, does that become the truth? Do people want to get away from all this AR and VR and get more in touch with nature, as we've seen through lockdown, get more back to basics, get more back to human interaction and real experiences? And, you know, as we can see design moving forward and this real merging now in technology between gaming and cinema and real life, the techniques and technologies, this is an example to show you here of new AI humans that can be created. It's really frightening and really shocking to the level of detail that these creations can be made. This is all coming from the Unreal Engine, which is definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. It's really forging the way in all the new game designs, but also in all the new cinema films. And so all this stuff created generatively, created in real time, and responding. You can now, there's a service where you can type in your script, get an AI generated face to say that. No longer do we need an expensive actor and an expensive studio. We can change and morph their appearance, their eyes, their gender, their ethnicity, and in different ways, but saying the same script. So nextly, on to, sorry, my last piece, that should say number 3 instead of number 2. Sorry about that, but is responsibility. And as Florence touched on, so the environment is really at the heart of the issue of where we go in the future. So, and how does this going to have an impact on brands, and especially our choices of brands, and our responsibility when it comes to those choices? So beyond 2021, you know, ethical design is going to be a real priority for businesses, especially when it comes to designing and manufacturing consumer products. You know, we are designers, we are the makers of rubbish at the end of the day. You know, it's down to us to really be sort of thinking about what materials we're using, how we're using them, how can we reduce our impact on the planet as we go forward. So we can no longer pretend that our actions don't have consequences. You know, as designers, we will lead the way in terms of building this new sort of consumer paradigm. One where a product story is as important as its price tag as well. You know, it's about bucking the notion that we all care about the bottom line. Instead, it's focusing on giving people the full contents of what's on the shelf in order to make some well-informed decisions. You know, going forward, companies will be encouraged to share their ethical story of any product so that consumers can clearly see not only, you know, the calorific value and the ingredients of a product, but identify the goods and labor and service that goes into everything that they buy. You know, instead of nutritional facts, we'll be looking at ethical facts. Where was the item produced? What materials were used to make them? What was the labor time used to create it? How long could this product exist in the real world? But by experience of interacting with this backstory creates a new layer of engagement. You know, we're mining the consumer's data for preferences and history, but instead points the magnifying glass on the product and the business practices. And we've really got to be aware as we go forward. The whole concept of greenwashing has been around for a very long time. But you know, while we provide more ethical transparency, which is a good thing for consumers and markets, we need to steer clear of the trap of corporate greenwashing, meaning that companies use false advertising to oversell their impact. So, you know, in order to truly affect the larger ecosystem of manufacturing and consumer behavior, it will take collaborative effort between designers, between us, and researchers and technologists and business leaders to ensure that the products are well researched, they're designed and built in a way that will provide a lasting value to people. and creating an all-round more equitable system. So those are the three things that I wanted to talk about in terms of future trends, and not necessarily the future of design, but I think you can see where design can have an impact in these areas, and what sort of offshoots will come from these. And I think, as Florence said in her piece as well, I think that the we don't know what the job roles will be of the future, and we've yet to discover them. And I think that's really exciting. Where you guys will be going in the future with this. So thanks very much. Have a look at our work on online and also on social media. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you both for presentations, both very thought-provoking. But we did have a question in the chat around sharing resources, and I see you've both been sharing a whole load of links and magazines and things to read, so that's fantastic. If there are if you've got questions, please put them into the chat, and I guess we've got another 10 minutes for questions. We had a question lined up that was going to be around core skills, but I think that was quite well answered, thinking about being informed, being present, taking advantage of opportunities, curious, broaden your references, and critical as well. And collaborative, you both spoke about that. So I thought maybe we could move on and pick up on some of the themes you talked about, with greenwashing, brands needing to step up, systematic discrimination, poor digital services, and wonder, coming out of the pandemic, have there been any positive or important changes which you think are here to stay? Is there any evidence of digital transformation being successful? We've talked a bit about video platforms. So is there any positive we can take from all the change recently that we think is here to stay?
Shall I go on that one first?
By all means, Kevin, yes.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of positives, actually. I think out of the pandemic, I think, we've all seen that return to nature, and I think, and also staying local, which has had a great, I think some of the bigger businesses have had a downside to that, but some of the smaller local individual, more craft-based sort of retailers and businesses have really boomed. And I think people have really enjoyed getting to know their local businesses and, getting involved with them. But I think it's sadly, it's the smaller companies around, the areas like Moorgates and Shoreditches and, around the city that have really been affected. And so, it's been a real mixed bag. But I think getting back to real reality, I think is something that we are all desperate to do, and desperate to get back to real people in real rooms. And, we've seen it just recently yesterday with the football, and, getting people back to actually being together and celebrating together. I think there's going to be a real burst. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this, return to the 1920s, and, of the 2020s are going to be the roaring 2020s. And I think that sort of burst in live events, live experiences, real experiences, is going to be really interesting.
Florence, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of, especially in the cultural sector, I think there have been a lot of lessons about what kind of experiences people are willing to pay for and appreciate. And, there was a lot of hesitancy around doing even live streams, for example. It's not because technologically we couldn't, but there were kind of institutional biases that was sort of oh, it won't be, it's not quite the same experience, no one will want to do this. But actually, I think people are now seeing it's a bit more interesting, a bit more sophisticated. People are a bit more sophisticated. People who might see something in person might still want to experience some other aspect of it, like online, and that there are actually other opportunities for developing communities and engaging people with, especially with more local, again, yeah, very much as Kevin was saying, especially with more perhaps local ballet companies or smaller orchestras or whatever. And I think definitely there's also been a lot more collaboration as well. I think that's something overall that's really come out. Actually, it's that I think overall it's just really cool. A lot more collaboration, a lot more willingness to experiment with different formats, and a lot more kind of willingness to take, I wouldn't say take more risks, but like to try different things, because I think people are now realizing it's not as scary to try different things, and actually you can very quickly learn from them and try something else. So yeah.
I think that's a really valuable lesson that, we can, or insight that we can all learn from, but certainly students, it's just give it a go, I suppose. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? There's a really nice question in the chat that picks up on one of the themes you were talking, Florence, about the physical nature of all this digital. Like there is a cost to this. So yeah, how do we go about creating or designing things that mitigate their impact upon the environment, and consider how much of that environmental impact is actually hidden when we're talking about digital infrastructure, so you don't actually understand that it's really there. What is it? Have either of you engaged in projects where there's a like a sustainability drive within the project that has maybe excluded certain techniques or pushed you to find new ways of working around a solution?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was just halfway through typing an answer actually, but maybe I'll just say it instead. I'll still click send. But yeah, it's interesting how I've seen a definite trend to website design, especially where brands and individuals are sort of really very conscious of the server energy that it takes up to stream video data, and creating websites which are looking a bit more like the sort of things we used to do in the mid-90s and 2000s, and going back to much more lower tech solutions rather than very heavy bulky video streaming solutions. And certainly some of the examples that I showed of that Unreal Engine, they're using pixel streaming on huge servers, which is really expensive, to be able to real-time render this stuff. And although we're seeing amazing advances in the visual look of that side of things, so we're seeing like people questioning, well, if I'm a responsible brand and I'm an ethical brand, is this really the right way to go? This does look amazing, but this is using up so much energy and technology. Is this a really right way decision to go in? So I think it's an interesting new sort of discussion that's being had in the design world, and it's going to be interesting to see where that ends up.
Yeah, for sure. I actually, in some ways, I think it's slightly easier if you're starting out from scratch. Like if you're starting out either with a huge digital presence, even if it's like simply a website, it can be often quite difficult if, again, very much depending on the context you're in, it can be very difficult to say change infrastructure. Like that's something we've definitely discussed at the museum, but we know, for example, we're not due for changing our hosts for another couple of years. So we know that we're having a much larger carbon footprint than we could potentially do, because actually the way the museum works, and this is the same for many other big organizations, it means that all these things are already pre-planned. In fact, this was probably planned like 15 years ago, and the funding has been allocated for that particular time. So yes, there are definitely things that one can mitigate with existing platforms as much as one can. If you are like designing digital platforms, websites, there are tools like EcoGrader and like website carbon check. There's a couple of them that I use certainly, and that's really good, at least to give you a baseline, and you kind of see what sort of things you need to do to make sure that your digital, at least your interface, isn't is as optimized as it can be. There are in fact a lot of like green hosting right now. Actually, it's funny enough, a lot of them don't really shout out about it as much as they should do, I feel. But actually, if you just do a very quick search, you will find quite a few like website hosters, website and software hosters who are either green or like green servers as they are. And I think if you're working in a kind of area or you want to work in an area which is a mix of, say, hardware or like the physical and the digital, again, it's probably much easier if you're starting from scratch than if you're either trying to improve an existing thing, because at least when you're starting from scratch, I think there are now just enough bits of information and the data and the ability to collect the data and the material providers who you can almost check it along every single stage of the production journey, like actually how ethical are they, do they pay their workers fairly, are they using recycled materials. You can pretty much do that along every step of the way for something that's new. And also that comes, that even including like the circular economy bit of it, wherein, so there are in fact like recycling companies that literally will take in anything and everything, and they don't just incinerate stuff, they find ways of reusing that stuff. But you have to look this stuff up before you've even started, maybe even before, if it's like, you know, you're ideating a product or a tool or a service, even before you've really got an idea, maybe even before doing user research. In some ways, it's kind of about taking the environment as a user and thinking about the environment as your first and primary persona, and doing what research you can to find out how you can like do least harm to them. So yeah, so that's something that definitely kind of exists, but just to be realistic, especially as you're going out into the industry, that yeah, have those conversations, network with people, and keep that awareness. But do not be surprised if what comes back to you is like, no, we're not touching infrastructure. We've already done this to our infrastructure. We're not going to touch this for another like 5-6 years. Yeah, so, yeah.
I was going to, I was going to kind of continue the kind of thread about kind of thinking about the future and how we can design for it in a way that feels kind of appreciative of context and appreciative of all of the different types of factors that might be influencing how we kind of use those technologies. So we've been working a lot with students who have a real interest in AR and VR in the last couple of years, running some kind of tester workshops in that kind of area. I guess one of the things that crops into my mind when I see these very technology heavy, incredibly immersive technologies is, are we playing with fire? You showed us Unreal Engine earlier, where you can actually kind of create a model that really looks like someone who exists and have them speak your script. So, as a designer, do we need to be qualified in these types of technologies and AI and all of the context around them before we start designing them? Just be really interested to hear your opinions on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, like I said, I think it is really scary. And every time I've done any sort of VR stuff or VR headsets, I have to say, I'm still not used to it. I still feel completely spaced out whenever I take the headset off and come back into the real world, because the virtual world that you do see is really seductive. It's really amazing. And it really is like sort of Ready Player One coming to life. I've got kids, and so it's kind of like, what's the future of their learning and their entertainment and their gaming experiences going to be with these new technologies? But I think for us designers, I think that there will be tools that come online that will help us to understand these better and help us to create as well as to consume in these fields. So I think definitely, as like Florence said before, sort of read and consume and do as much as you can to learn about this new world, and because there will be some amazing design opportunities. There's so much bad looking stuff out there. I think in the game world especially, it just and at the same time there's now some really, really lovely games that are out there that have been really well considered and well designed, and creating those environments, getting away from that stereotypical sort of male gaming, smash 'em up sort of future, sci-fi future. What can this look like in different walks of life? What can this look like when you sort of think about that technology being used in different ways of different subject areas, different people creating, and those sort of worlds? Because I think there's some real opportunities to do some really nice design work with this stuff, because there is so much bad stuff out there.
Yeah, no, and it's a really good question. I think I would say actually yes, and I've increased, and it's not so much, but I think the technology in itself is really cool and really interesting. But as I mentioned, it's often the context, which is what informs what a technology becomes. We've seen that with the internet, and there was a really interesting question as well about social media, which I think is also a really good example how actually it became particularly dangerous, kind of correlating to a particular point on the stock market when these things now start having to really show that they have a particular value to their stakeholders, to the people using these platforms for advertising. That's often when like the real problematics kind of go into overdrive, because that's when they are encouraging like particular types of engagement or particular types of content, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in order to try to generate income, or at least to generate a certain level of income, which can then justify their stock valuation. So yeah, I absolutely would agree that like I think it is definitely playing with fire, and for me it's because I simply don't see the structures that are there to either support designers or support consumers. I think we actually do have the institutions who should be out there doing things like ethical accreditation, doing these kind of checks and balances on products, and they're not doing it, which I think is quite worrying, because I think some of it, and I know because I've been to some of these meetings and these discussions, some of it is because they don't want to be seen as anti-progress. They don't want to be seen as like holding back. Some of them might have been wrong about Facebook and don't want to be wrong about something else. They don't want to seem behind the times. But overall, what it means is that we have a lot of like institutions and organizations who aren't really stepping up. And so what that means is that, yeah, we are, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I also shared some of those communities to start joining, because I think if for designers to get the education that we need, not just the education, but also the protection, because the reality is that when you go off into industry, you are probably going to be, if you care about this stuff, you might be like the only one, whether in your department or your team or whatever. And so you do have to learn who to talk to, how to talk to people. You might have to start, I would very much encourage people to think about joining unions and start joining ethical design organizations, because these will be the ones that actually back you up and help you. Businesses have their own issues and their own difficulties which you will encounter. So if you want to make a change, or if you want to speak up about something, you need to be protected. And that is something that I think really cannot be taken seriously enough, especially because I've seen a lot of the applications of so AR technologies that are beneath the hood are powered by, say, machine learning techniques. And often when you encounter or try to talk to the companies about this stuff, they either don't want to deal with or talk about the potential issues. So things like insurance companies who recently actually on social media were like, oh, we have a great facial recognition tool, which means that you can tell essentially if someone is lying, or if if their property should be is a slightly higher value than they might have said in the application. And when inquired about this, like there's absolutely either no understanding or like a not willing to talk about how this technology has been used. In other cases, we're seeing technologies like interviewing technologies. So this again is why being part of a union is really important, because you might find yourself being interviewed by companies who are using technologies that can like see whether your face matches someone who will match someone who will work in their company. And for all that, scientists and ethicists have been saying, this is phrenology, this is nonsense. You cannot tell someone's personality from the shape of their face or the shape of their head. Different cultures, different languages even have different ways of physically showing their emotional responses. Like for all of that critique, absolutely nothing is happening. This stuff is still being made, it's still being evaluated on the stock market, it's still being used, it's now being used more and more by companies. And so I would say that to the question, should designers get qualifications in AI? Do you know, I don't think it would hurt. I often say with digital design, and in fact, Amy and David, you might have even heard me rant about this before, so if I'm boring you, do forgive me. But I often say that it's funny with digital design, how maybe because we've taken on the hype of being ephemera, we kind of forget that we're still very materially rooted. And in the same way as even your most highfalutin speculative architect will have some basic understanding of building materials. They won't be an expert, obviously. There are other people who do that kind of stuff. You know, even the most like avant-garde director will have some understanding of editing techniques. The most avant-garde fashion designer will often have excellent tailoring and sewing skills. It is quite interesting how often as digital designers, we maybe don't have the coding skills or the solution architecture knowledge or the knowledge about how AI actually works or machine learning, even though this is actually the medium that we're using to build. So I would say it maybe actually getting a degree in it is going too far. But yeah, I think because of the fact, quite frankly, no one else is looking out for us. And that's becoming increasingly clear. And as I said, the contextual imperatives aren't there and probably won't be there actually for far too long. We've already seen companies like, so whether it's companies like Facebook who have literally been brought up before Congress, which is one of the highest levels of political and legal, I suppose, like safeguarding in the United States, and have done absolutely nothing in spite of the fact that they have been actually publicly embarrassed by Congress, have still done nothing. In the EU, we've seen companies like EA Sports, for example, again, literally being dragged up to be put to task for putting in like gambling mechanics, which we've now seen several studies that show the danger of these mechanics in these games, both for people who are neurodivergent, autistic, children, and yet they're still doing the things that they're doing. So yes, I think we might actually, and I hate to say it, I think we might actually have to start, if it's not AI, it's policy, start taking extra courses and all these kind of things, because and definitely and join some kind of collective, because there's no one else looking out for us, quite frankly. It's just up to us.
Well, a rallying cry to finish the talk on. Good. Yeah, I think being conscious of time, we're probably going to have to wrap up now. That was super interesting, both your presentations and answers to the questions. And we can see a lot of convergence on themes between both of you, even your very different practitioners. You know, we've talked about gaming technology and the impact on our senses of reality, responsibility, checks and balances that designers and brands, you know, we need to up the ethical nature of the work we do and understand that there are risks in the future. It's not all shiny, and it's going to require really critically engaged and informed designers to understand the medium that we're working in, help to make positive decisions and changes. Positive note that we do have is that, you know, the jobs of the future are yet to be defined, right? I think we've all kind of agreed that. And you know, being a creative and critical that, you know, students on this course and joining this course will be, you know, can be part of defining those jobs in that future. So it hangs in the balance, I guess, for what's next. So yeah, thank you, Florence. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Amy, for great presentations, questions and chats, and for the questions as well in the discussion. So everyone who's attending, we really hope you enjoyed it, and hope to do these again in the future. And I'm sure Florence and Kevin will be back to join us on the course next academic year and in the future. Thank you very much.